We started this series on church history by looking at why anyone, especially evangelicals, should study church history. And now, on session 55, we breach the Reformation era and the likes of Luther and Calvin and Cranmer come into focus. But before then, we need to address one final character in the story and recap a bit of the context of Western Europe at the Reformation so that the scene is truly set for Martin Luther to forever change the world. Europe in the late 15th century, 1450 to 1500, is a thing to behold. Over the past 100 years or so, things have changed and changed fast. The death of so many landed gentry and princes and lords in the Crusades, followed by the Black Death, in which 1 in 3, in some places half of all people died, had led to the creation of an upwardly motivated and independently wealthy middle class. On the back of this, universities had popped up in cities all over Europe. The fall of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire in 1453 to the Muslim Ottoman Turks, had flooded Europe with skilled artists and an absolute treasure trove of manuscripts and learning from the Roman Empire of the East. And that progression following the fall of Constantinople would lead to mass fear and panic that they were not just in the now times, but the end times. By 1526, the Ottomans would kill the King of Hungary. In 1529, they were besieging Vienna itself. 1451, this is the extent of the Ottoman Empire, just Anatolia and taking Constantinople and the area around. But by 1566, look at the size of the Ottoman Empire, not just across Africa, but how far it extends into Europe. There was real panic and fear that this was the end of the world. And all of those new manuscripts and learning from the East, they wouldn't have amounted to much had it not been for the invention of the printing press in 1440. Now the learning of these Eastern Christians and their studies and the studies of universities and other individuals could be widespread. Now education could flourish among the newly established middle class. This is an age of discovery, of cultural and scientific advancement. In 1492, Christopher Columbus crossed the ocean blue to discover the New World. For perspective, and this is to me mind-blowing as someone who started off in life wanting to be an archaeologist in Central America and now obviously became a Christian minister, in 1521, Hernan Cortés would defeat the Aztec Empire. The same year is the year that Martin Luther would be excommunicated by the Pope. The same year that at the Diet of Worms he would declare, "Here I stand," regarding his conviction that only the Bible could be the foundation of Christian faith and teaching. The start of the Reformation and the fall of the Aztec Empire start in the same year. In 1500, it would have been theoretically possible to gather in a pub somewhere in Europe Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, Copernicus, Erasmus, Machiavelli, Columbus, Cranmer, Zwingli, Luther. All of these individuals, not Calvin, he's a bit later, could have gathered in 1500 in a pub for a drink. This was the Renaissance, the birth of humanism as a mode of study, not the modern atheist understanding of humanism. This is Renaissance humanism. It's a time of unparalleled change in Europe. But it was also a time of nearly, but not totally, unprecedented corruption and immorality in the church, in monasteries, among bishops, among clergy, and especially at the top in the papacy. In 1492, Pope Alexander VI came to the papal throne. Now, you may not have heard of Pope Alexander VI, but perhaps more likely you've known him by his real name, his original name, his birth name of Rodrigo de Borgia. The Borgia popes, the Borgia family, a byword in Italy for corruption and scandal and worldliness. Rodrigo Borgia was relentless in using his papal power to further his earthly family's already wealthy and powerful influence. He had multiple mistresses before he became pope, when he was still a cardinal who should have had no such things. And his daughter, Lucrezia, would be someone he elevated to a position in the papacy usually reserved for an ordained cardinal. And in fact, he would leave Lucrezia in charge of much of the papacy while he went away on holidays. So wicked was this pope, the Borgia pope, that his successor refused to live in the same rooms. Now, these were rooms that were beautiful, filled with amazing art. After all, it was the Borgia Pope who brought Michelangelo and Raphael, among other amazing artists, to the city of Rome. The thing is, the Pope who refused to be in the same rooms as Borgia popes was a Pope known as Julius II. Now, Julius II, he didn't take his papal name from Pope Julius I. Instead, he took his papal name from Julius Caesar, the famous pagan Roman imperator. And he was known as the warrior pope. He was known as the fearsome pope. And he regularly wore full battle armour and carried lance and sword as he went about his duties as pope. He formed the Swiss Guard. He waged wars across central Italy to try and secure his kingdom of the papacy. He's the one who decided to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, using Michelangelo and many other talented artists and architects from that time. But the cost of his wars and the cost of St. Peter's Basilica was so exorbitant that he began to promote indulgences, the paying of money to the papacy for time off purgatory. Now, Julius II himself, he only became pope because he successfully bribed every single cardinal apart from one. Like the Borgia Pope, Julius also had children by mistresses. So wicked was Pope Julius II that Erasmus, who we will soon spend most of this session considering, said that Pope Julius would be denied entry to heaven itself. And he would be so angry about this and so prideful that he would try to storm the gates of heaven by force in order to get in. So, there's two wicked popes. Next comes Pope Leo X, the Reformation Pope who ran the papacy from 1513 to 1521. And this Pope would double down on the spending of Pope Julius and the spending on his own ridiculously lavish lifestyle. He would be the Pope to send out people across Europe to sell indulgences to pay for St. Peter's Basilica, and thus ultimately lead to Martin Luther posting the 95 Theses condemning this. Leo himself was only ordained as priest 4 days. 4 days before he was consecrated Pope. When he was elected to be Pope, he wasn't even ordained. Thankfully, he's the last Pope for which this was the case. Not so thankfully, he wasn't the first. But Leo's spending and borrowing of money to fuel his lifestyle and artistic and educational programs was so great that on his death, multiple banks went bankrupt because they were unable to get back their loans. He was known at the time as a pope who had so-called unnatural vices with regards to taking advantage of the handsome young men who he employed as his chamberlains. Suffice it to say, therefore, that the papacy was not exactly popular. And this is an era in which the emergence of an educated, free-thinking middle class with vested local interests would promote the rise of nationalism, something that weakened the influence of the Pope, the influence they'd had for so long over kings and rulers. Well, no longer. Increasingly, those rulers would stand up to the Pope, enabling them to protect the coming Reformation. No more would people think of themselves first and foremost as Christians and Roman Catholics, but they would think of themselves first and foremost as French, as English, as Saxonian, and so on. Now, it's into this boiling pot that there is one final important figure to mention, which I haven't done already. A name worthy of being mentioned among those I did before: Michelangelo, Machiavelli, Copernicus and Erasmus. This is a man, an Italian man, named Lorenzo Valla, 1407 to 1457. And Lorenzo Valla is somewhat of a father to humanism. Humanism was a branch of the Renaissance which focused on the idea of returning to the sources, of going back in order to find the original truth, of going back to the source and investigating things, not taking it for granted that just because it is now, it always was. And in a world where most people never travelled more than 7 miles in their life, people took for granted that how things were is how things had always been. It's why art of King David shows him in medieval armour, because they had no idea it would be different. It's why you see pictures from the time of Jesus with medieval castles, because they presumed it had always been that way. Now, Lorenzo Valla would do two important things with his humanist movement, which would lead to the Reformation. The first is related to the authority of the Pope. One of the key documents of the medieval era for supporting the complete political and not just religious authority of the Pope in Western Europe was something called the Donation of Constantine. The Donation of Constantine, which was an imperial decree by Constantine the Great, who united the Roman Empire, transferring authority over the Western Roman part of the empire and authority of Rome itself to the Pope. And this was a key document in the pocket of the Pope as he battled with authority of Western kings. The problem is that that document, like just about everything else, over 90% of the documents included in something known as the pseudo-Isidorian decretals, were forgeries. They were lies. It never happened. Constantine did no such thing. Nearly everything in those pseudo-Isidorian decretals was fake. All the quotes from past popes and church fathers, fake. All the alleged documents, lies. But the whole collection was used from the 12th century onwards to increase the power of the popes over both the church and the world. Now, the donation of Constantine didn't date from the 4th century, but the 9th. And Valla argued this. He argued that the donation of Constantine had to be a fake, because Constantine couldn't legally have given that authority to the Pope at that time. Also, there was no evidence at that time or at any point afterwards of any kind of administrative change taking place. And importantly, the text of the donation was what we call anachronistic. It was out of time. It was the wrong time. It contained things that were out of place. One example is this, that it used the word satrap. Satrap, which is a Persian word for a regional governor. Why would Constantine the Great use a Persian word, mainly from a later date, to describe things in Western Europe, when the Byzantine Empire itself only ever used that word many years later, centuries later, only for the ruler of one Armenian province? It doesn't fit. But not only that, the Latin of the donation was confused. It was really poor Latin, with tenses constantly changing within the same paragraph, not at all reflecting the language which was seen in many other imperial decrees they had from that time. And here we see that humanist method influencing the weakening of papal power. But more than this, Lorenzo Valla also applied this kind of systematic thinking to the Latin Vulgate, the Bible translated by Jerome and used throughout Western Europe. It led him to question if Jerome was right to use the Latin word penance to translate the Greek word metanoia, or repentance. And Valla would say this mistranslation of penance instead of repentance called into question the whole system of sacramental penance to a priest and, of course, indulgences. But Valla's work would not be widely spread at this time. He died only 17 years after the invention of the printing press. But his work was found in the library by one Desiderius Erasmus. It's a great name, Desiderius Erasmus. If Valla was a father of humanism, Erasmus is the so-called prince of humanists. A deeply complicated figure who bridges the gap between pre-Reformation and Reformation. Desiderius Erasmus was born in 1466 in, probably, Rotterdam. His father was a Catholic priest, and his mother was the priest's mistress and likely housekeeper, something that Erasmus resented and saw as a moral stain upon his life and family, and he believed that their deaths to the plague in 1483 were a sign of God's disapproval of that illicit relationship. Though he went to the best schools when he was younger, it was poverty that ultimately drove Erasmus into the monastic life in 1488. And he was later ordained a minister in 1492, but he never really did much with his ordination in terms of actual ministry. Like so many in his era, he looked around and saw the corruption and the abuses of the monasteries and the clergy and the bishops, and he resented it and wanted no part of it. He longed for some kind of reformation and change. Eventually, his studies took him to England, where he would go on to teach at Cambridge and also at Oxford. And it was in Oxford where he would hear the preaching and teaching of one John Colet, who, rather than mythologizing and allegorizing the text of the Bible, looking for hidden spiritual meaning, Colet instead approached it from a humanist perspective, looking for the original meaning of the passage in its context. And this deeply impacted Erasmus and led to him wanting to master the Greek language so he could pick apart the text in the same way. Just as Wycliffe was based in Oxford, so the ministry of Colet in Oxford would lead directly to the Reformation proper. Whilst he was self-teaching himself Greek, he found Lorenzo Valla's notes on the Greek of the New Testament, and he felt the need to work on a new update of the Vulgate Latin Bible, because he looked at the Latin Bible and he looked at another copy of the Vulgate and another copy of the Vulgate, and he saw that there were errors, there were differences between these various copies, because it had been copied tens of thousands of times. And on the back of this, he decided to create a Latin and Greek New Testament. And importantly, he wanted to do it before a Spanish team could publish their very own impressive Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, Latin, separate columns, Bible polyglot. This Spanish team had even finished their New Testament in Greek and Latin, but Erasmus knew they didn't have permission from the Pope to publish it. So he was on a timer. He was rushed. He had to collect all the Latin he could, all the Greek he could, and put them together. And thus he rushed this work and he got it published without papal permission. A really risky move. But he just relied on the pride and vanity of Pope Leo and put a dedication to the Pope. He dedicated this project to the Pope in the start of his book, and so he got away with it and he published his work first. It worked. Interestingly though, Erasmus's main focus at first was actually the Latin text because of these inconsistencies that he found, and especially when he went back and he looked at Jerome's commentaries on the New Testament. Now, those commentaries were much bigger volumes, they hadn't been copied as many times, and naturally they also included the Vulgate itself, Jerome's own translation, and he saw that there were differences. And so his focus was on the Vulgate, but he brought along the Greek in order to justify and show that it was a good Latin translation he was proposing. But because of this, and a lack of Greek manuscripts, what Erasmus often did is edit both the Latin and the Greek he had to make them line up perfectly. In fact, he had to make up the Greek of the entire final 6 verses of the book of Revelation, because he didn't have the book of Revelation in Greek. He only had a commentary on it in Greek, and not only that, that commentary was missing the last 6 verses. The back end of the book had simply fallen away. And so for the last 6 verses of Revelation, what Erasmus does is he looks at the Latin and he translates the Latin into Greek and pretends that that is the original Greek. Now he does a good job, but the Greek he comes up with is not found in any other manuscript. It's not part of the Bible. It was his own translation and imagination. And yet it forms the basis for the King James Bible and so many others. An interesting thing for sure, which we dealt with in a previous 2 sessions of this series when we were looking at Bible translations and projects around the world church. Now, it was Erasmus's New Testament which was used by Luther to translate his German Bible. And ultimately it was Erasmus's work which became the basis for Tyndale and the King James, as well as, in the end, via a guy called Stephanus, the Geneva Bible. And through his Bible research and his own criticism of many of the practices of the Roman Catholic Church, especially his ridicule of the relic trade and pilgrimage trade and his lambasting of vials of Mary's breast milk and saying things like there's so many pieces of the true cross you could build Noah's Ark and there's 10,000 nails from the cross and more thorns in the crown of Christ than there are thorn bushes in the world. Erasmus just lambasted these things, and he lambasted indulgences and penances in the church as well, as Valla had done. Because of this, he helped create the Reformation. He's the one who set the ball rolling for this Reformation, which then could not be stopped. But he did want it to stop. He opposed, in the end, the reformers on many levels, and he remained a faithful Roman Catholic. He believed in transubstantiation. He believed in the authority of the Pope. He believed in the authority of unwritten church sacred tradition being equal to that of the Bible itself. And he saw worldliness and excess and wicked things in the Reformation leaders, just as he did in the Roman Catholic ones. In the end, Erasmus he didn't want to take a side. He didn't want to support the reformers. He didn't want to support the Roman Church. He wanted to just be an impartial scholar, doing his study and doing his work above such matters, which ultimately meant he didn't move. He didn't join the Reformation, and he was cut off from it. Famously, Luther and Erasmus, who never met in person, would clash over the idea of free will, with Erasmus championing the idea of free will among humans, and Luther claiming that the Bible taught that human free will was in bondage and chains to sin, and so humans are not free to choose God of their own accord unless God first breaks those bonds. Luther would even, in typical Luther style, as we're going to find out over the next few sessions, go so far as to claim that because Erasmus disagreed with him on free will, Erasmus was simply not a Christian. Erasmus would die in 1536 without receiving the last rites, either because they couldn't get there in time or quite possibly because he disagreed with the very idea. But he would die in 1536 in Basel from dysentery. But the Reformation would rage on without his support and without his presence.